There we go. Okay, so hello everybody and welcome again to Yard Care in a Changing Climate. This is the first of our fall series with the City of Everett in partnership with Snohomish Conservation District, as well as the Washington State University Snohomish County Extension. So we thank very much Everett for sponsoring these classes, and I'll tell you more about what we have going on here in the next week or so. My name is Carrie. I am your moderator and the technical help for this evening. I'm the Community Engagement Project Manager at Snohomish Conservation District. You can see my information there. I never miss an opportunity to share a picture of my garden, so you can see that on the left. But I totally believe in native plants and trying plants that are interesting and that just sort of suit the climate, and it's all a work in progress, and it's kind of an experimental thing. So I encourage everybody to have fun with their garden, and hopefully tonight you learn a little bit about different ways you can manage your plants. So tonight, please, for asking questions, for my ease and for your clarity, use the Q&A function that's found at the bottom of the window. I will ask your questions of the panelists. We're going to break it up into basically 3 sections and then a general Q&A at the end. So Carrie's session will do Q&A at the end of hers, and then Elyssa's, and then Rachel's, and then we'll have more time at the end if you have more questions. If you have any technical problems, feel free to put those into the chat. And you already heard the little warning message, we're recording this class, so I will be able to send this out to you after we are done today. So today's flow, we have Carrie Brausieck from the Snohomish Conservation District. She's one of our farm planners. She's going to cover climate change, different data sets, and kind of the basically the information about what is happening with our climate in our region, but also offer resilience tips and things we can do. Elyssa Kerr is going also with the Snohomish Conservation District. She's going to cover native plants and different things that maybe you've seen this summer as you're looking at some of our favorite species and changes with them, and maybe suggest some things that might work on your property. And then finally, we'll have Rachel Schroeder from the WCU Extension Program, and she's going to talk about cultivars, nativars, and ornamentals, because we know people love those too, but also which plants might, not native to here, will actually work better in our changing climate in the next 10, 15, 20 years. So, and again, at the end, we'll have question and answer and by section, so there'll be plenty of opportunities to get those answered. So again, I want to thank our host, City of Everett. On the left, you can see kind of the brochure. So many of you may have seen that either in the mail or online. But again, join us next week. We're going to do another session called Warm Up to Winter Gardening. And this one's going to be more practical in that, we won't be back to you on the screen, hopefully in person, next spring. So what can you be doing in your garden this wintertime? Things you can plan, things you can prepare, so that way, and plants you can actually grow during the winter season. So that's what we'll be talking about next week. Also, April Hines with the city is going to be doing a rain barrel sale and then a building workshop. The dates are there, October 9th, if you just want to buy a barrel and take it home, ready to go. Or if you're ambitious and you want to know how those are put together, you can save, I think, $10, and then you can build a barrel. So make sure to go to everettwa.gov/rain barrels to learn about that, or reach out to April Hines with the city and she can get you set up for those. The other thing I didn't put on this slide but is available is a rain garden tour. If you register where you found this class, everett.eventbrite.org, .com, excuse me, you can get a map sent to you of the rain gardens in North Everett. And then you can kind of walk around and see them in the different statuses and years that they've been running. So we can send that to you as well. So quickly, what is a conservation district? So 3 of us on this tonight all work for the district. We work in different aspects of our work. Farm planner for Carrie, I'm on the outreach communications team. Elyssa's on the habitat side and restoration side. So, but we offer free technical assistance and financial assistance to land managers in Snohomish County and Camano Island. Those are our 2 parts of our district. We're 80 years old this year in Snohomish County, 60 on Camano. And we work with anybody who wants to better their land. It's a voluntary basis. So really you can have us out We can help you with projects you want to be working on. And if we know about funding, then we can try and work with that too. Kind of depends by city. In this case, Everett sponsors this. They have their rain garden program. We work with them on that, but it varies by jurisdiction. So reach out to us if you have any questions. So again, Carrie Brausieck is with us this evening. She's a resource planner, so she works mostly with farmers, but her specialty really is agroforestry and other, I guess, like the old ways of doing farming that are coming back into new fashion, but people who want to try something new, something innovative, where maybe you have apples growing with hay, or maybe you have your cows walking down your field where you're also growing another plant. So Carrie kind of handles that type of work, and she's been doing a lot of study with climate change. And so trying to have more resilient landscapes. So she'll be talking about that today. And then Elyssa Kerr is our plant sale manager. She's the habitat project coordinator for the district. And I believe she said that she's holding twinberry in this picture. This is from this year's plant sale. She's very good at recognizing sticks. So if you come to the sale, she'll help you figure out which ones you should be taking home. And she's going to focus on native plants today. Just a couple of events coming up for the district. The water discussion, we're coming back to carbon crushers. That'll be next Wednesday, the 6th. And the biggest thing we have going on in October, or Orcatober, is Orca Recovery Day. This will be the 4th time we've done this, and it is a chance to get out on a restoration site, pick up trash, do something that is good for our southern resident killer whales. Closest to us, we're going to have an event in Mount Lake Terrace for the at Lake Ballinger Park. It's for all ages, kids and families and such. Come by. You can find more on betterground.org/ORD or go to our website. And then last but not least is Rachel Schroeder. She is with WSU Extension, Snohomish County, and she's their rain garden program manager. Rachel helps with designs related to rain gardens and also works with the Natural Yard Care program for the county. And just a little bit about the master gardeners. Probably some of you have called before, but they're the ones that can sort of, if you give them a question, they'll look it up and find the answer and get back to you. And right now, the best way to get a hold of them, kind of because of COVID, is to just simply email them. And you can send a picture and just say, hey, I got this plant, I got this bug, I got this something, and they'll get back to you with an answer. So without further ado, if there's any questions, feel free to write those in the chat now. But other than that, I will be turning it over to Carrie, so if she can come on camera.
Hello.
Hello. And then you should be seeing, let's see. New share. There we go. Climate change resilience. Are you seeing that, Carrie?
I am, yes.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so I'll go off camera. Thanks, Carrie. We'll see you.
All right, thanks, Carrie.
Welcome.
Yeah, so I'm going to kick us off here with just sort of a high-level overview of what we're looking at here in the Pacific Northwest. So go ahead and advance to the next slide, Carrie, if you would. Yeah, so an overview here. I'm going to talk about the predictions for the Pacific Northwest, some possible impacts, then briefly sort of touch on this concept of resilience, and then briefly touch on some basic things that we can start to do on our own landscapes in the face of these changes in our climate. So yes. So I want to start out with this resource, UW's Climate Impact Group. They are an amazing resource for climate data, climate predictions, reports. They do a lot of public speaking, but really all pertinent to the Pacific Northwest, to our region, so making it local. A lot of the stuff we hear about is, global scale predictions and global scale kind of stuff. So they're a great resource to bring it home, make it local, and really talk about what we're going to be facing in our environment, in our backyards. This report here that I have highlighted, No Time to Waste, is a great report to give you sort of an overview of what we are facing as our climate starts to change here in the Pacific Northwest. They came out with this in response to the 2019 International Panel on Climate Change report that was released, which is that huge global scale climate report that comes out every few years. They took that, synthesized a lot of that down and really highlighted impacts local to us. So great resource if you want to explore this topic a little bit more. Next slide. So just drawing off of their work and their information and that report, I'm just going to touch on some high level sort of trends that our climate is starting to move into, right? So these are things that we are starting to see. What this is not saying is that from every day from here on out that our climate's going to look like this. Our climate is still going to go through cycles. We may still have a summer that's quite rainy. We may still get a winter that's really snowy and we get a huge snowpack up in the mountains. These things might still happen. But in general terms, the trends are moving in this direction for our climate. So in the coming decades, our climate's going to start to look more and more like some of these bullets that you see here on the screen. So we're looking at, in general terms, these warmer winters, where we do end up with these lower snowpacks. It is estimated and predicted that we're still going to get a lot of precipitation in the winter months. What's interesting about that is some of the data and predictions are showing that our precipitation amounts may not change that much in the Pacific Northwest, but what may change is that we may experience all of that yearly precipitation condensed into a few months over the winter and the early spring, so that we start to see these big rain events and storm systems come through in the winter, in the spring, and then we're kind of rained out then at that point, and we have these then sort of longer, drier spells as we move through the summer and into the early fall. Sort of what we kind of have experienced this year. So this year has been sort of a great example of what our climate might start to look like in the next few days. Of course, with this sort of precipitation coming down all at once, we're looking at possibilities of higher stream flows in the winter months and earlier peak flows earlier in the spring. So if that precipitation is coming down warmer, if it's in the form of rain instead of snow, if snowpack does melt off earlier because of warmer temperatures, all of this water coming through our rivers and stream systems within those timeframes, and that could potentially increase flood events or amplify flood events that we might have during that time. And then that is going to translate into these late summer flows decreasing, right? So less water coming down through the system through the summer and early fall months. And then possible sea level rise. The numbers you see there are an average projection for the coastline of Washington state. So in some areas, we may see higher sea level rise on our coast. In other areas, it may be lower than this, but this is just a general average of our overall coastline. And then we're looking at these drier events. We do, in the Pacific Northwest here, we do go through cycles where we do have some drier years, where we do experience drought conditions. That is natural within our system. What climate change is predicted to do is to amplify those kind of natural cycles that we tend to go through. with these drier years and these drought conditions. Again, kind of similar to what we saw this year. And then these warmer summers overall. So yeah, general trends that we're starting to see that our climate may start to look more and more like as we move into the coming. Next slide. And these changes are going to have impacts. Impacts to our forests and our ecosystems, impacts to wildlife, and even human impact. So just to touch on a few, forest impacts, looking at our forest ecosystems, we're looking at potential expansion of certain species and dieback of other species. We're looking at possibly the increase of insect and disease outbreaks, definitely looking at impacts from drought stress. And after the heat events this year and sort of this long, dry summer, I can already drive around and see the trees a lot of trees are already showing their drought stress. So that is already visible on the landscape after this summer. Changes in species composition. We may start to see this in the next several decades. And the shift in ranges of certain species. We may have certain tree species that begin to move north. We may have some that come up into our area from the south. And then the possibility of certain species dying out of our forests. In 20, 30 years, there may be species that we see today that we don't see anymore in our forests. Next slide. And then we have impacts to wildlife. We're all, I know, aware of some of the challenges that many of our salmon species face. And unfortunately, climate change is not going to help them out in any way. It's going to make their life even harder. So with increasing temperatures, with decreasing flows in our streams and rivers, especially in these summer months and in these drought-like conditions, our salmon species are going to continue to struggle. Marine heat waves are becoming more common, and this has implications for a lot of our fish species, and then in turn for marine mammals as well. Similar to forest to plant species, we may have range shifts in certain animal species. We may start to see fish in our oceans that we don't typically see. We may start to see bird species come through that we don't typically see. And then just to express the implications of that lower snowpack, it can have implications for wildlife, for our fish, obviously, but also other wildlife that are adapted to that snowpack and use that snowpack to ride out the winter months. So just a few of those impacts that our wildlife could face. Next slide. And then we have human impacts, of course. Heat-related illness. Unfortunately, this summer we experienced these intense heat events and did have some fatalities from that. These heat events can exacerbate people that already have existing illnesses. It can make those illnesses worse. Warmer and drier summers can result in yield reductions in some of the crops that we grow here in Washington State. And certainly after this summer, many of our farmers did experience some of these yield losses with some of the crops that they grow. We're looking at, recreation losses potentially in the winter and the summer. If we have less snow, it could be harder to ski. We can have a shorter ski season, less water coming through our streams and rivers in the summer. It could mean less fishing. It could mean, that stream that you used to inner tube on, you may not be able to do that. And then there are also costs associated with this, infrastructure costs. Looking at our built environment and how it's going to adapt to some of these extreme weather events, these increases in flood, or these drought-like conditions, right? We may have to look at and adapt some of our infrastructure, and that's going to take some investment. Next slide. But the good news is we still have time, although I do want to put here a sense of urgency. I would maybe argue we don't have a ton of time, but we do have time. So it's a great time now, right here in the present, to think about what we can do. And we can all start in our own yards, in our own landscapes, in the landscapes where we have some agency. Maybe it's our backyard, maybe it's our community garden, maybe it's a local park that we go to a lot. Next slide. So what can we do? How can we start and engage with our landscapes to start to tackle climate change and to adapt to these changes that we know are coming and to these changes that we are already experiencing and we can already feel and see on our landscapes? One of the best things we can start to do in our own backyards, in our own little garden spaces, is we can start to work to build resiliency. Next slide. And what is resiliency? Right? So resiliency is really just about going into these systems. Our backyards are an ecosystem. Our gardens are an ecosystem. Our, community gardens, our parks, these are all natural ecosystems of various complexity, right? So what resiliency is about strengthening these systems to be able to withstand and respond to these changes that are happening. Next slide. And so the way we start to build resiliency into our landscapes is through diversity. And so if you go after this talk today and you dump everything out of your brain and I have said to you, that's fine. The one thing I want you to remember here is this: diversity equals resiliency. When we're talking about our backyards, when we're talking about our gardens, when we're talking about farms and forests, when we're talking about landscapes out there in nature, diversity equals resiliency. This is the mantra for tonight. Diversity equals resiliency. And it's great to walk out in your backyard or walk out into your garden beds or wherever it is. And to walk out there, look around and say this in your head a couple of times. Diversity equals resiliency as you look around your landscape. And you really start to get into that mind frame of, oh my gosh, maybe I could insert something here. Maybe I could diversify this space in an interesting way. You really start to get into that mindset as you say this mantra in your mind as you're walking around your landscape. And when we're talking about diversity out in our landscapes, we're talking about diversity in different plants, right? How many different types of plants can I fit into these spaces? We're also talking about diversity in structure. How are we structuring these plantings within our backyards or gardens? And then that diversity that's going to be attracted by all of this. Diversity in wildlife, diversity in insects, beneficial insects, pollinators, diversity in songbirds and small mammals. All of these things are going to add resiliency to our landscapes. Next slide. And so just to touch on diversity a little bit here, diversity in plants, right? Can we start, even as something as simple as a lawn, right? Many of us have some lawn somewhere on our property. And can we get out of this sort of old Victorian, aesthetic of this green lawn and start to appreciate something that might be more diverse? Something with a couple more species in it, right? Even just in the lawn landscape. How many different species can we fit into that lawn and accept and be okay with? And then can we even move past that and start to really appreciate this diversity in structure, these different layers within the way we plant? Next slide. And this can even translate, from our lawns into even our raised garden beds, our, where we grow our fruits and veggies, right? We, a lot of garden beds are, flat, or they're the raised bed and we're putting our lettuce and our kale and things like that. Can we start to grow our food in these different structured formats, in layers? All of these pictures you see at the bottom here, they are all full of food and medicinal plants. The same types of things that you see in the garden bed up, in the top there, but just planted in a different way, planted in a structure. And when you plant in these layers, you get more resiliency in that system than you do in the garden bed that you notice up towards the top of the screen there. If we have a big heat wave, you're going to get more resiliency in the types of plantings you see below than in the type of planting that you see above there. And I have this even on my own landscape. I have lawn space, I have some raised garden bed spaces, and then I have some food forest type spaces that I've structured like in these different tiers. And when we had this heat event, it became very visually evident to me, the resiliency of the different types of plantings and these different structures. My lawn turned crisp and brown. My garden beds, they survived, but I had to water them quite a bit. Whereas my food forest spaces, they made it through. I'm not going to say they didn't get some damage. They didn't get a little sunburn. Some of the fruit got a little burned, right? Some stuff wasn't looking great. But as compared to some of these other landscapes around my property, I could scrape back the soil and I could see moisture down there. I could see a lot of the understory stuff still green and pretty thriving. So lots of resiliency in that structure, in that diversity of structure. Next slide. And then the power of native plants. So native plants are great to be plugging into our landscapes anywhere. They can be used, I mean, we have tons of beauties, right? Look at the beautiful ones I just have here on the screen, right? They add interest, they add seasonality, they add beauty and structure to our plantings. We can plug some of these in with the food plants. In my food forest, I use wild ginger as a ground cover, for example, right? I use vine maple in some areas for some overstory plantings. So native plants are important because they provide habitat benefit. But I also want to highlight native plants because there's a lot of new research showing that native plants are particularly good at storing carbon long term. Any perennial plants that you start to plant in your landscape are good at doing this, right? Perennial plants are fabulous for sequestering carbon and storing carbon long term. So not only can we make our landscapes resilient to climate change, but our landscapes can also start to help with climate change by starting to mitigate and store carbon out of our atmosphere. But for some reason, there's some research out there that's finding that when you do native plants, these native perennials, they are just particularly good at sequestering and storing that carbon. They don't know why yet, but these are some of the findings that are occurring through this research. So native plants are so important for structure, for habitat. They're adapted to our environment and they're great at sequestering carbon. So great for helping make our landscapes beautiful, resilient, offering that habitat benefit, bringing in that diversity of wildlife, and also being a part of helping to mitigate for climate change. And so I think that's a great transition over to my colleague Elyssa, who's going to talk about native plants now in our landscapes.
A perfect introduction, Carrie. Okay, here I go, sharing my talk. Can you see that?
Yes.
Perfect. Thanks, Carrie. Okay, so we're going to jump in, as Carrie mentioned, to native plants as part of this yard care in a changing climate. So Carrie gave a great intro as to why native plants are so important. You know, they provide that structure and habitat for our native wildlife that are kind of used to these species. They're plants that have been here for thousands of years in most cases, and they're well adapted to the climate that we have and have had. They also, in general, you know, require a little less care than some ornamental plants or cultivars potentially. They require less water, less maintenance. They're pretty used to being in this ecosystem. So all some really great benefits to native plants. And as Carrie mentioned, they're great at sequestering carbon, which we love. And so really I wanted to kind of talk briefly about what it means to be a native plant. As I mentioned, they're really these plants that have been around in our ecosystems for a long, long time. But as our climate is changing and as we're seeing, you know, species distribution change in some cases, we're starting to have conversations in the restoration field about what is native and what do we plant in anticipation of some of these climate change impacts that Carrie mentioned. So there's a lot of conversation going on right now about assisted migration, potentially moving species into Washington that maybe historically have spent most of their time in Southern Oregon or into Northern California. So we're going to start seeing our climate look a little bit more like that. So some folks are starting to plant things like redwoods and sequoias, you know, things that haven't historically occupied this area, but do well and should do well into the future. That being said, the other conversation that I've heard a lot of is about seed sourcing. So anytime you're planting native plants in your garden, it's important to kind of consider, where did this plant come from? You know, some of these plants live all up and down the West Coast and are native throughout the West Coast. And if you plant a seed from a tree that has been living in Snohomish County and all of its ancestors have been living in Snohomish County for the last thousands of years, then it should be well adapted to Snohomish County's conditions. But as we see changes, maybe it might be better to source that seed from a tree that's grown in the Willamette Valley in Oregon. That might seem more similar to the climate we're anticipating and the changes we're going to see. So thinking about seed source of plants, I know this is kind of complex, but it's something that we're starting to discuss a lot in the restoration field, and something that I think it's important to mention, that what is native and how we source these plants is kind of changing at this unprecedented rate that we're seeing the climate change as well. So in general, you know, as I mentioned, our native plants are well adapted to this region. That being said, that adaptation is something that's occurred over a long period, over slow changes. And what we're seeing is really rapid changes. So some of that adaptation to our climate is not adaptation to the anticipated climate that we're experiencing. So a lot of our plants, you'll have noticed, there's a lot of drought and heat stress after the summer. And it's something that's, you know, been going on as that trend has headed that direction. And that drought and heat stress is one thing. You'll see a lot of trees that are getting these kind of brown tips, and they're going to bounce back as long as we have a pretty normal year for the rest of the year. Some of them may die. But what it also opens up plants to is susceptibility to disease. So what we're seeing is some of these plants that we know are kind of intolerant of drought, intolerant of heat stress, they're becoming more and more susceptible to specific diseases. So I wanted to talk through a couple native plants where we're really seeing these trends of you know, drought and heat stress and or susceptibility to disease. These are plants that, you know, we're seeing a lot of this: Western Red Cedar, Western Hemlock, Big Leaf Maple. These are plants that I'm a little nervous about, and I'm nervous about their future. So I just wanted to bring these up as kind of species of concern. as you're considering what to plant in terms of native plants. So Western red cedar is a big one. There's been a lot of indication of some die-offs happening of Western red cedar. And so some indications of this are dead tops, brown canopies, and thinning foliage. So these are things to look out for if you have Western red cedars in your neighborhood. There is a really great community science effort, this foresthealth.org and at Forest Health Watch. You can log sightings of declining cedars if you witness them in your neighborhood or as you're out and about hiking or visiting a local park, and help track kind of this trend as they're trying to figure out what's happening to these Western red cedars. So Western red cedar is like a big powerhouse tree that we have in our region. They're big and gorgeous. I have a big one in my front yard that I love dearly. So one to keep an eye on, and just know that this plant is stressed by drought. And it's something, you know, to consider. If you do have a cedar, I spent some time watering my cedar this summer out of fear for that big tree that I have in my yard and wanting it to stay strong, knowing that it's drought intolerant. Another drought intolerant species is Western hemlock. So we've seen a lot of die-off of Western hemlock in our region as well. Primarily, you know, Western hemlock, not drought tolerant, but there's also been identified a couple pathogens, both a root pathogen and a foliar pathogen, that are impacting Western hemlock and likely being exacerbated, the impacts being exacerbated by some of that drought stress for Western hemlock. So another one to keep an eye on if you've got some in your area, if you want to plant some, time to baby those plants. And then last but not least, in terms of our declining plants, is big leaf maple, you know, a staple of our area. This paper just came out this summer regarding their decline. It's been noted since 2011 that big leaf maples have been in decline. And, you know, what was noticed is that this decline is a recent phenomenon. It's associated primarily with sites that are closer to roads and with our increases in summer temperatures. And really, it's these hotter urban sites that are predisposing the Acer macrophyllum to mortality. So they've really linked, they've been studying this for many years, they've linked these higher, hotter temperatures, summer temperatures, to impacts and die-off of big leaf maple. So big leaf maple is another one that's really struggling with kind of these trends that we're seeing, and one to keep an eye on. So again, I just wanted to reiterate that, you know, this drought stress is leading to susceptibility to disease, and is kind of calling into question some of those adaptations that we think of as our native plants being really ideal for our conditions. That being said, there's other plants that we can plant and other native plants that are still rock stars out there. The big thing I wanted to stress, I know Rachel's going to talk about this a little bit more, is that as you're looking to plant native plants, you know, we've got some of these guys that I want you to keep an eye on. And I've got some folks, you know, some other plants that are really good in a lot of conditions, but it all comes back to ensuring that you're planting the right plant in the right place, and ensuring that you're looking at what kind of conditions does this plant like? What does it need? Does it like really wet roots? Does it like a lot of exposed sun or not? And what parts of my yard are really good for that? And then even as you're planting native plants, they're great. They are inherently resilient, and they're good at building resiliency in your yard, but that doesn't mean that they don't need a little bit of care. So certainly thinking through, as you're planting these native plants, if they are in a really sunny spot, or if we get a really stressful hot summer, these plants may still need to be watered. They may need mulch around them to help retain that moisture. Babying your native plants is a great idea. As they get established, they'll thrive much more than some other plants that might need baking throughout their life. But those young native plants are definitely going to need a little more attention in your yard. And again, as you know, if we get 3 months of drought, that plant might need a little splash of water to keep it going. So I wanted to walk through a couple plants, some native plants that I think are rock stars and that can survive a variety of conditions, because these plants are ones that I want to recommend to you for your yard care and planting native plants. So a good one, the first one I wanted to highlight is short pine, Pinus contorta. These plants can handle pretty much any conditions. So you'll notice their moisture requirements are dry to wet. That's the whole spectrum. Their light requirements are part shade to sun. So this plant doesn't love a full shade, but will do well as long as it's got a little bit of sun or in full sun. And shore pine are fairly small as far as our conifers in our region go. So their maximum height is around 50 feet. So they stay pretty long, pretty low if you have, issues with larger tree species. And shore pine are awesome. So love them. Another great plant that I really love is grand fir. I'm planning to get some at the Snohomish Conservation District plant sale this year. They're a bigger conifer, so 200 feet instead of that 50 feet that our shore pine grows to. But again, they can hold onto a lot of different conditions. So dry to moist, shade to part shade. They don't love full sun, but can handle any little bit of shade there. And these are the really wonderful smelling Christmas trees. So, this is one that has really lovely smell to its needles that I think is awesome. So grand fir is a rock star and will grow big and tall, will be a really good, carbon crusher for sure, sequestering a lot of carbon as it grows through its full life. And then in thinking about the potential, disease and die off of big leaf maples, I wanted to present another deciduous option. So Cascara is a really great tree that we have in our region. They're deciduous, again, not super large, 15 to 30 feet mature height, and they handle all kinds of conditions. So dry to wet, part shade to sun, and these Cascara are a great deciduous option if you're worried about that big leaf maple die off. Okay, and then I wanted to highlight, kind of get smaller. So I started really big. Trees, if you can plant trees, that's ideal. We want the more trees in our ecosystem, the better, providing lots of shade, sequestering a lot of carbon. But if you don't have the space for a tree, there's a lot of shrub options too in our native plants. These two are two of my favorites that can really handle a lot of conditions, dry to moist, part shade to sun. So they're, thriving in a lot of different conditions. And both are really beautiful flowering species. So the red flowering currant has these nice pink flowers. My hummingbirds love them in my yard. And then the ocean spray has these beautiful white flower sprays. It looks like a wave coming off of that plant. So two really gorgeous plants. They do get pretty big, so up to 10 feet for both of them, pretty wide as well. But really wonderful plants and good shrub options for natives. And then two more shrubs with slightly different conditions. So these ones handled all the way from dry to wet or moist, and then any light conditions, shade to sun, both salmonberry and snowberry, really great native plants, kind of both thicket growing. So salmonberry in particular will kind of spread via rhizomes and may take over a small section of your yard if it's got the right conditions, that produces really great edible berries. And then snowberry, no edible berries, but gorgeous white berries that stay on the plant throughout the winter. So kind of a nice pop of white out in your yard and through the winter on that shrub. Okay, and last but not least, as we get smaller and smaller with our native plants, is our ground cover. So a lot of ground cover options on our native plants. These are just a variety of options for color and cover and different leaf shapes. And a lot of variety in ground covers and their light and moisture requirements. So I highly recommend checking out some ground cover options for your yard, as they'll help with that diversity of structure that Carrie was talking about. Okay, and I wanted to throw out just a few resources too for you to research these native plants. I've given you just a handful of native plants, but wanted to highlight a few of my favorites that handle a lot of a variety of conditions. And will hopefully be resilient and help you build a resilient yard. So King County Native Plant Guide is an awesome resource that has a lot of different options. You can just look up native plants by going to the Find a Native Plant option. They have some landscaping plans that you can actually just like look at, okay, well, my yard's pretty shady and dry. What plants would go there? And they've highlighted some great plans and landscaping plans and plant lists. And then you can even in this create your own custom plant list. So you can start adding plants to a list and revisit what you've added to your list as you're going along. So this is a really great tool that I love a lot. And then the Washington Native Plant Society has also another plant directory, which has information about plants, all the different native plants, and again, their light and moisture requirements and other fun details about those plants. And then last but not least is the USDA plants database. So they have information about all the plants in North America and including, distribution and where they typically are, and has really great information about all different kinds of plants. So if you want to just, run a plant through there and see what its conditions are, that's really great too. Okay, and then where to get native plants. There's a lot of nurseries in our area that will sell native plants, and they often come in pots and are big and expensive. And a really great cheap option is to visit our Snohomish Conservation District native plant sale, which I manage. So obviously I'm biased, but I think it's the best sale around. Our sale is usually in late February, early March. This year will be the weekend of March 5th and 6th in 2022. And you can right now visit our website, theplantsale.org, and you can browse our shop, which is not currently open for purchasing, but just kind of gives you an idea of what plants we sold last year. We'll be updating it in the month of December with the plants for this year. It'll likely be very similar. We sell somewhere around 75 different species of native plants, and we sell them in bundles of 3 to 5 most often. Most of them are bare root plants, so they're very small, young plants, and they'll come without any soil, without a pot, and it'll be really easy to get them in your yard and get a high diversity of plants. Because we don't have soil in a pot and because they're really young plants, they're fairly cheap. So at some nurseries, you might find, a beautiful vine maple that's in a 10-gallon pot and it's $50, and we'll give you 5 little tiny baby vine maples for $10. So big difference, lots of plants. If you've got a big yard or a big space that you need to fill with native plants, I highly recommend checking out our sale. We'll be opening pre-orders on January 24th. So that's the best way to purchase plants is by going online and pre-ordering. We're hoping to have some in-person sales this year, but we'll see how it all goes. So January 24th pre-order is the best way to go, I would say, to start with. Okay, great. That's all I have. Do we have any questions, Carrie, that I can answer?
We do have questions. One of them from Aaron is, what is the best approach for removing invasive blackberries that are encroaching on native species?
That's a great question. If you have a small infestation of blackberry, my best recommendation is you want to get up all the roots. So do your best to dig up that blackberry. Blackberry have pretty big roots, and some of them have these kind of long tapering fibrous bits. So digging all of it up, blackberry can regenerate from tiny little root chunks and even from larger chunks of just the blackberry cane. So kind of piling that on site, getting as much out of the soil as you can, and then coming back year after year to dig up any new sprouts, because as I said, they'll regenerate. So finding those spots where the root resprouted and digging it up, if you have that ability to be really hyper attentive to the area where your blackberry was. There are some chemical control options. King County Noxious Weeds has a really great blackberry control fact sheet and a blackberry control page. So they have more details about potential chemical options if you have a really large infestation or kind of a monoculture of blackberry. That might be a better route because digging up all those roots is really tough, especially if you're doing it on your own.
Yeah. And then from Facebook, I have kind of a comment and then a question. One was, and I think you addressed this, Elyssa, that the person had been noticing giant sequoias being planted in the area. So it does sound like that is because of the change of the weather that they're actually doing well here.
Yeah, so we do have a lot of giant sequoias and redwoods that were just planted when folks colonized this area and thought they were really cool. So you'll see those really mature redwoods and sequoias that were planted, 100, 150 years ago. But certainly there are people now actively planting those in anticipation of them doing better. So our climate has been okay for redwoods and sequoias, but as people are like, oh my gosh, what if Western red cedars do really croak around here? What can we do differently? Maybe sequoias.
Yeah. And then the question is from Laura is, we have planted a number of natives. One ocean spray we planted last fall was really stressed this summer by the heat. We are hoping it will come back next year. Even though our rain garden died out substantially this summer, the 2-year-old plantings of twinberry, red twig dogwood, and high bush cranberry are really thriving. She is finding seedlings of Douglas firs and hemlock tucked into the mulch under them and hoping to be able to transplant some of them. Any tips for doing so?
Yeah, okay, so I have one comment about the ocean spray first. So ocean spray, like I said, our native plants need a little bit of care. So if it was just planted this last fall, it probably wasn't super well established, and then it gets hit with that really hot summer, and it's going to be really sad. So those really fresh plants, if we get another hot summer next year and you plant some, this fall, and then they're stressed next year, give them some water, help them along because they're still trying to get established. And then in terms of transplanting those seedlings that you're finding, those seedlings aren't going to have very big roots yet. As they get bigger the roots are, the bigger the area of dirt you need to dig up to make sure that tree has enough of its roots to hold on to. But just digging up a wide area around them to make sure you get all those roots, the least amount of stress as possible for those little seedlings. And then moving them to a spot, again, like if it's a Doug fir, they want sun, put them in the sun. And if it's a Western hemlock, they want shade, put it in the shade, and give them a little bit of water this summer if it's hot. You can pot them up too and let them grow up in a pot a little bit longer and find a new spot for them. So
cool. Thank you. And a few more questions.
Oh,
From
yay.
Renee. I know. Do you have a program for large rain collections such as 3,000 gallons so you can water during the summer?
Carrie?
Yeah, talk to Elyssa about this program we have. I will put her contact information in the chat, I think is probably the best way to do that.
Love that.
And then Marielle asks, when is the best time to plant native plants, now or March? Or does it depend on the plant?
Yeah, great question. So usually we at the Conservation District do a lot of big, large-scale native plantings, and we pretty much start now and go through March. So anywhere as those plants are dormant, fall to early spring is the best time to plant them when they're not actively growing. Right now they're just kind of hunkered down, waiting for summer when it's nice and bright and light again. So we plant our native plants anywhere between October and March, which is why we do our sale in late March. It's kind of the last opportunity for you to get out there, and hopefully the weather's a little bit nicer before those plants will be a little more stressed. You can plant them year round. They just might need more care, more attention. We like to plant them in winter because then we run away and hope our plants survive until we come back to mow down grass. So that's the best time to do it.
So a follow-up to that question though, but isn't it cold? Isn't there a risk of frost?
Definitely a risk of frost, but our plants are adapted to it. So as long as their roots are not exposed, I wouldn't like take a plant out of a pot and leave it sitting there overnight when it's going to be frosty. But otherwise, as long as they get back in the ground is much warmer than the frost above the ground. And all those plants at that point are dormant. And so they're not really thinking about the frost on their twiggy bits or, their leaves if they're an evergreen.
And then one last question. I saw a large die-off of red alder in my yard in the last couple of years. Have you seen this as well in this area?
That's not one that I've seen specifically. Alder is a pretty short-lived species. So if they're older alder, it's possible that that's just kind of the end of its lifespan. Alder also tend to grow up their early successional species. So they grow in really disturbed areas and sprout a bunch of sprouts, and then they'll kind of start out competing each other and die off a little bit.
I'm going to ask this question, but we're going to probably pause it till the end so we can have Rachel speak, but it's about high soil acidity. And so we'll come back to that one at the end of the presentation. So
perfect.
Thank you, Elyssa, so much.
Of course.
All right. So now I will share my screen and then Rachel will get going on a next series, which will be about cultivated plants here. Let's see. Rachel, let's see. I wonder if, let me make sure I can see you. I just see me right now.
Okay.
There you are. Okay, good. It should switch over to you now. So go ahead and you can get going.
All right. So we've heard a bit about native plants, and now we're going to move into cultivated plants, including some cultivated native species. So you may have noticed that this past summer we had stretches without rain that were nearly record-breaking, and it had a lot of impacts on plants, both the native plants as well as plants grown in our gardens and lawns. And basically it's a combination of both high temperatures, a lot of sunlight, and low amounts of water. So the plants that were hit really hard, we looked this one up just recently. This is a David viburnum. These are very common as landscape plants. These are not native, but these were pretty hard hit. And the best thing to do for azaleas, rhododendrons, hydrangeas, and these viburnum is to water them very deeply to help get over that drought stress, as well as put some mulch down and actually not prune them. Even though it looks pretty bad, all of the dead growth, wait until the summer months are over, because the dead growth will actually provide some shade for it in the hot summer months. So what this boils down to is that with the changing climate, like potentially hotter, drier summers and more water in the winters, is choose plants for our gardens that can tolerate these extremes. Next slide. So Snohomish County at snohomishcountywa.gov has great steps for natural yard care. There are 5 steps, and the second step is plant right for your site. And that ties in directly to choosing the right plants that will thrive in your area. And underneath this particular step, if you go to their website, you'll notice that there are a couple more resources. One is called Choosing the Right Plants, and the other is called the Plant List. So I'm going to spend just a few minutes talking about both of those. So this is from Choosing the Right Plants. You can see a diagram, kind of generic one, looking at an overhead view of a garden and lawn. And the key thing to take away is that you need to take into consideration moisture, so wet versus dry areas of your lawn. And usually wet areas would be sort of lower level, lower elevation, kind of the bottom of the slope, or if you have a sort of a depression in the ground. And then dry areas often are well-drained soils or at the top of a hill, or just areas that don't get a lot of precipitation. And so we need to think about these. How will these areas of our lawns and gardens be changing in a changing climate? So areas that were sunny and hot in the summertime will be even hotter and may need a little extra help with watering. So the plant list is an excellent resource. It's very long, and I just took a few screenshots from the website in order to give you an idea of what this looks like. And it's divided into different sections based on the conditions that the plants thrive in. For example, this section, as you see at the top, is the wet winter and dry summer plants. So these plants are great because they can tolerate both extremes. And under this heading, then it's divided into trees, shrubs, and then the kind of non-woodier plants. And you can see there are a few trees here that seem to do pretty well in full sun. You can see the column right in the middle there. All of these tree examples do well in sun, some do well in partial shade. You'll see a capital N next to a few of these, which indicates that these are native to the Pacific Northwest. So that's always wonderful. And I don't know if you'll notice, but by some of these, such as underneath the tree picture to the right of the screen, you'll see VAR, variety. And so what we're talking about here are specific varieties of these trees, even if it's was originally a native, and that are cultivated and that are doing well or predicted to do well in these areas. Next slide. So here's an example of some shrubs. And another thing you'll notice from these lists, other than the N for being native to the Pacific Northwest, is on the left-hand side of the screen, these little dark colored leaves, which indicate great plant picks. And so these are sort of, you know, the best of all the different worlds. So on the leftmost column, you'll notice those are the scientific names or the Latin names. And then to the right of that is going to be your common names. And these are usually a lot easier to pronounce and a lot easier to ask for when you're looking for these plants. And basically the difference between a tree and a shrub is that shrubs tend to be shorter in stature than trees at their mature height. And then they also tend to have multiple stems, woody stems, instead of just one main trunk. For perennials, grasses, and more, so here we're getting smaller and smaller in terms of the plants. Again, if you're looking for plants to put in your garden, the more little symbols you can find on this list next to it, the better, because they would thrive in sunny and shady conditions, as well as some being native or cultivated varieties of native and great plant picks. So things like sword ferns are very popular, different ferns, deer ferns as well, and wood rushes, as well as carex, which is a type of sedge. It looks grassy, but nice ornamental look to it. So this is an example of the greatplantpicks.org website. And on the left-hand side, you can see different helpful lists of plants. And I selected drought-tolerant plants. And then you can see that it divides this into drought-tolerant in sun or drought-tolerant in shade. And then within that, whether the plant grows from a bulb, whether it's a cone-bearing or coniferous plant, grasses, perennials, etc. And so this is a great resource when you're trying to fine-tune the right plant for your particular environment, and then one that will do well in the predicted changing environment and climate as well. So with cultivated plants, what separates these from native plants? I'm going to start with the bottom one because that's actually the easiest to define. An ornamental plant is basically bred through artificial selection, through human breeding, and selecting which plants cross to look good. Whereas cultivars are basically cultivated varieties of plants, and they tend to be, a variety is just a subgroup within a species that look alike, but may look slightly different from the larger grouping of species. And nativars would be cultivars of native plants. And I asked the Snohomish County Master Gardeners that I worked with what their examples would be of nativars or cultivars that would do well in a changing climate. And Karen suggested manzanita, which basically means little apple. And these are gorgeous shrubs that are basically being cultivated in many different varieties because they can grow tall, some can grow short or shrubby. A lot of them have this beautiful red trunk or bark on their stems. They create berries and they do well in really difficult, dry and poor soils. So we could be seeing more and more of those. And from Mandy, another master gardener, she actually suggested different cultivars of Western red cedar or Thuja plicata. And there's one in particular called Grünekugel, which is German for green ball. And you can see that in the lower left picture. And other examples that might do better in shady environments would be the lady fern, just one particular variety of ferns. And you can see different varieties listed like lady in red, which I believe is the picture shown here. And Mandy also provided her own personal list that she created of nativars. She was very excited that I wanted to talk about these cultivated varieties of native plants. And she provided this list to me that she had created of different ferns, as well as shrubs and other flowering plants for this area. So please let me know if you have questions.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you, Rachel. One question that, or well, just comments from Facebook. People are loving this presentation. I think it's because it really is providing really good ideas of plants and how it's all changing. So thanks for that. And then this question, I chime in, Carrie or Elyssa, but the question is we have high soil acidity on our property. How does that affect trees? Is it something we need to change?
I'll just say something briefly. I'm hoping Carrie might also have some words of wisdom, but we generally have pretty acidic soils in the Pacific Northwest. So our native plants are used to, you know, moderately acidic soils and will do well in acidic soils in general. Carrie, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, if you're looking at native trees, yeah, acidity is not an issue. If you're looking at apple trees, or you're wanting to do some things like that, you might do a little bit of lime to bring that pH back up a little bit.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Going back to Carrie's presentation earlier, there was a comment about a lot of these things that may happen, but they see some of them happening now. So
Yes.
I guess how can we be mindful of what we're seeing and take those actions, which is kind of where your presentation went, Carrie, but just that recognizing that some of it is already occurring.
Yes, yeah, these are just general predictions for our part of the world, or you know, for our region here. But yes, some of these things we're living through them right now, and it's hard to know. You know, these are general trends and predictions, and a lot of times you see things like in 2050 or by 2100, and unfortunately, some of the things we are noticing with some of these predictions is that we're starting to see them now instead of in 2050. So some of these things are occurring more rapidly than were predicted. So yeah, now is a great time to be aware, to be noticing, and to be making some of these changes.
Thank you for that. Yeah. So another question that came in from Renee, can you add lime to the soil now for apple trees? Getting lots
Yeah,
of
now is a great time to lime. Probably, yeah, now through mid to the end of October, but in the next couple of weeks, here's a great time to get some lime down and let it do its thing over the fall and winter months. And then in the spring, as you know, plants start to really take up nutrients again and come out of dormancy, then yeah, that soil will be ready to go.
Cool. And again, feel free to put questions into the chat. The reason Elyssa and I kind of shared a moment earlier is related to the water collection. We do rain barrels as well, but there are larger cisterns that can be happening, and there's studies happening and funding right now, and she could speak to, that's why I'll put her email in the chat. But where you can do larger collections, because not only is this happening, but there's a lot of funding and ideas going around this type of work to figure out ways to store water when it can be used later, and or divert it now, so it's not just hitting your foundation. That's why I have a rain barrel, but then to be able to be used later. So people are paying attention to water. If you're interested in that, I invite you to come to our session next Wednesday, October 6th. Carrie will be there again, because that will be our topic related to project drawdown, tying into carbon and how water plays a role. So if you're interested in water, please come to that. And then I will put Alyssa's email in the chat so she can cover your question about 3,000 gallons. Another question just came in from Carol. I am renovating my yard and garden now, wondering what trees can be added for a 10,000 square foot site to promote cooling and shade in a suburban neighborhood.
Any native trees. I think checking out like some of those resources that Rachel and I shared about different, species lists and things to check out for your specific sun and moisture requirements would be great. But a lot of our native trees will be rock stars at that. A lot of our conifers are pretty slow growing, so it'll be several years before they're providing really, really great shade. But that's, an option for sure, is looking at some of those native conifers for longer term shade.
There's a comment too about mulch and how that plays a role in this. Could one of you address how that helps with watering and keeping plants with water longer?
Yeah, so one of the main things too, when we're thinking about having resilient landscapes, is always keeping that soil covered and not having bare soil. And there's different methods of doing that, and mulch is certainly one of those methods of really, having a good thick layer of mulch that really does help hold moisture in the soil profile longer. Helps with organic matter input and lots of different things. So yeah, having big areas of bare soil or bare soil, uncovered soil around tree roots, around things, can be, have water be evaporating fast. So yes. Another thing is ground covers. And I think, Elyssa talked about native ground covers. So that's another method of keeping your soils covered as well, is through ground covers, mulches, cover crops in your garden beds, those types of things.
Thanks, Carrie. Yeah, I don't think there's really a bare square foot in my garden. And it's because something has either filled in the space or volunteers through birds, through seeds, through all these different things. It's all full. And I just have to identify what I want to keep and what I want to get rid of, but it all helps with moisture. So a couple more questions, one from Facebook. Two from Facebook. One was, with a lot of rain during the 6 months of the rain, but drought during the summer, poor and rocky soil, could the manzanita do well? So this one maybe more for Rachel.
I believe it would. And with most things, if it starts to look a little draggy, adding a little bit of water can't hurt.
Agreed. And then also, I think same person was asking, can you remind us where to find those species lists you just mentioned? So maybe Rachel, if you could put that list in the chat, and then I can share it to Facebook. So we will get that out to you, Sophia.
Yes.
And then another question came in from Renee. I planted 30 black hawthorn trees 5 years ago, and they were 3 feet tall and none have bloomed. They are nice tall trees, but no food for birds, which was the purpose. Maybe a comment more than a question, but any suggestions about black hawthorn trees?
I would just say in general, if they were small to begin with, it takes some time for them to mature and to flower and fruit. So be patient. I know it's hard. The fruit will come and the birds will come.
I'm just taking one more look at, some more questions and comments. One was about the ocean spray from a comment earlier. We watered the ocean spray a lot, still hoping it will make it through next year. And then Pamela asked,
I hope so too.
Absolutely. Pamela asked, will the recording be available? Yes. Thank you for the answer on the other question. Yeah, put your answer or your question either place and we'll get to that. Okay, so and I will put this chat from Rachel into the Facebook event, so that way you have the links to those, the great plant lists and choosing right place, right plant kind of stuff. So are there any more questions from the various sources? And feel free, if you want to raise your hand, I can unmute you if you just want to ask a question. Sometimes it's easier than typing. That's fine too. got a comment that basically says, appreciate the extra advice from Facebook and stuff. Lots of thank yous, and no more questions I'm seeing. So I think with that, we will stop for this evening, but I will be sending out probably tomorrow, if not Thursday, the recording to the people who signed up for the Zoom webinar. And then also on Facebook, the recording there will show up. We'll also have the slides. So I'll post those on our website so that way you can go back in and look at them, because I know that it's hard as it's moving past you to grab that link and such. So just look for a combination of things for me, probably on Thursday, actually. And we got another, you all did great. Thanks, everyone. So have a wonderful night, and don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any questions. So thanks so much, Carrie and Rachel and Elyssa. Great job.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks. Bye, everybody. Have a good night.